I gather, Dr. Fromm, that you feel that much of Freud still stands today with modification, with addition, with additional understandings and additional knowledge to be built in or built on, and in some cases contradicting. Is this what is happening with these quarrels that run between the various schools of psychoanalysis?
Well, I'm afraid that something quite unfortunate happens. Something for which you find perhaps a parallel in certain political and more so perhaps in certain religious movements. That there is a fruitful and important idea, but then it becomes bureaucratized. There are vested interests which take charge of the idea and who lay down the law what is and what is not in conformity with it. Actually, I think the problem which is so often raised today, is one for Freud or against Freud, is quite silly. It's about like saying, is one for Newton or is one against Newton? Freud made scientific discoveries, and it is the very essence of science that it changes by new findings and by new modes of thinking. I have tried to say in the beginning of our conversation here that Freud's ideas were of course conditioned by his time, by the philosophy prevailing in his time. And indeed, the human race has changed considerably in its whole outlook in these last 50 years, in many ways for the worse, but in many ways also by seeing a wider horizon, by seeing new concepts. If you take, for instance, only the new concept of one world, the overcoming of provincialism, or by the new concepts which theoretical physics have created. In other words, I think with Freud, as with any great scientist, the problem is to see his basic discoveries, but then to go on developing them, continuing them, changing them, with new insights, with new facts, and with new points of view which the development of the human race permits us to have. So that it isn't a question of being for Freud or against Freud, but that it is a question of seeing that Freud has created the basis for a new thinking about man, but that to be true to this basis, one must not stay there and just repeat what Freud has said, but one must develop his insights in the new frame of reference which the development of our culture has taught us, and expect and hope that a few generations from now, whatever we know and think will be transformed in terms of new insights and experiences which our grandchildren will have.
Well, do you feel that our lives are somewhat different, slightly changed, or perhaps vastly different because of Freud and what has followed upon Freud in the way of continuing to think and continuing to search and continuing to ask questions within the frame of reference set by Freud in developing an image of man?
Well, Mr. Harder, I think this question is the question, or amounts to the very general question, what is the influence of a great man on history? And I feel it's a question which cannot be answered in simple yes or no terms. On the one hand, a great man, I would say, and this is his genius, always expresses, makes explicit that which is already implicit and potentially given in a certain stage of historical evolution. And in that sense, he doesn't really create something new. But in another sense, by making explicit things which are not yet explicit, he enables people to think, to follow up, to develop ideas, and in that sense, he has indeed a great influence on culture. It really goes back in a way to what we were saying in the beginning, that a great man is at the same time transcending his time and is a child of his time. And I would say from this it follows, he helps changing lives, but in another way, this change which he promotes, which he furthers, is a change which is already prepared and potentially there in the historical situation in which he lives.
Well, gentlemen, on this possible recapitulation of Freud's thought and inquiry into his relationship to modern thought, I must say I am struck, first of all, by the penalty which a great man sometimes receives, even if he doesn't earn it, and that is by having his own name converted into an ism. So often, what is brilliant and guiding and distinctive in the ideas of a great man becomes almost submerged by the quasi-dogmatic material which begins to appear when that man's greatness allows itself to be expressed into an intellectual movement that has the word ism after it. I think of Marx, I think of Freud, I can think of others, and I think it is symptomatic here that isms following great men tend to appear oftener in the realm of the social sciences and in the humanities. How seldom, if ever, does one hear of, say, Newtonism or Pasteurism in the physical sciences? And this may well be a penalty that any great thinker in the social sciences or in the mental sciences faces as a result of the very greatness and creativity of his thinking.
We deal, Dean Nisbet, with so many variables in the examination of people and of the environments in which people live that it is almost as though there needs to be some kind of hypothetical construction on which to base one's discoveries or explain one's discoveries, which it seems to me is responsible for this development of isms in the field of investigation of the social sciences. Freud himself complained throughout his life that there were too few of his followers who were making significant additions or revisions to his concepts. He was aware of the freezing tendency that was taking place with Freudianism. He was in the position very often, which he bitterly complained about, that even when he would be present in a room, people would talk about Freud and Freudianism as though Freud were some sort of traditional, long deceased individual.
I have the feeling that many of his followers converted the brilliant insights and suggestive ideas of Freud into what someone has called a self-sealing system. And wherever a man's ideas or wherever a philosophy or methodology becomes converted into a system of this kind, it seems to me that the possibilities of new knowledge are almost wholly closed off. Professor Ross?
I'm reminded of a Chinese saying that a good teacher leaves no footprints. But this, of course, makes an impossible demand upon any teacher, Freud included. And I suppose when a man has come along with a new hypothesis that seems to throw a great deal of additional light on hitherto unexplored or misunderstood areas of human behavior, this idea or hypothesis tends to take hold with a great deal more emotional force than perhaps is justified.
And when one is talking about discoveries or hypotheses about man himself, rather than just about the falling object, let us say, then we are subject to even more need for distortion.
True, and we all feel that we are experts on this one subject of man, just as in the field of religion we seem to assume that we're all experts.
That's one of the great difficulties that is faced, I think, by the social sciences and the mental sciences in a way that does not trouble the physical sciences. We're dealing always with behavior or forces of behavior which in many respects are open to the average person so far as his own observation is concerned, and more to the point, a great deal of what we're concerned with in the social sciences involves terminology that is open also to the average person in his everyday speech, and it makes it very difficult for us in the social sciences to give precision to our terms.
Well, we are measuring, when we attempt to evaluate a psychology of man, we are measuring man through man. It's as though we were to weigh a scale on a scale and attempt to devise a scale. We begin with the very thing that we're trying to measure or study.
Very true. Professor Ross?
And don't we honor a man like Freud, most adequately when we are willing to recognize our subjectivity and our own involvement here, both as disciples and just as human beings, weighing human beings, when we try to have something of the freshness of approach and something of the daring that the teacher had himself. And isn't this what we really need today, and which Dr. Fromm is referring to? We need to be just as exploratory in our approach to the unresolved problems in human behavior and the gaps in our knowledge regarding human nature as he was in a day that did not like many of the things that he said.
One of the problems that I think we face in this field today and have faced for the past 20 years is that the students of psychology have had to destroy the authority figure of Freud and have expended their energies in doing this rather than in making any discoveries. For example, I think the most vivid demonstration of this is in the apparent lack of information, the lack of observation that Freud was able to contribute about the psychology of the female. And we find ourselves today with a great many lacunae in our information about feminine psychology. Freud never pretended that he had the answers to feminine psychology. He kind of glossed over it rather lightly. This either wasn't particularly important, or he was hoping at least that it could be explained in the terms of the male psychology. And what we find happening today is that those investigators who do try to give us some answers about feminine psychology are constantly attacking Freud first, wasting all of their energies on defending their positions or on tearing down what they conceive of as an existing statement of fact about female psychology, and therefore not devising a structured psychology of woman.
It's an interesting commentary on our time, I think, that most of the women who have written in this field have gone on trying to understand femininity through the masculine eyes of Freud and his followers.
Yes, or vehemently protesting that Freud was all wrong.
Yes.
Is another aspect of Freud and his relationship to contemporary thought that seems to me to be shared with the relationship of systems in general to contemporary thought. As a social scientist, I am impressed by the fact that less influence is being exerted on the works and ideas and investigations of individual social scientists today by systems than was the case even 20 years ago in the 1930s. I remember when I was beginning my own work in the social sciences that at that time sociologists, economists, and others were much more given to identifying themselves in whole or in part with systems. The systems that came from the economists Marshall or Keynes or Marx or others, and today I don't find this present. It seems to me that we have, in a sense, emancipated ourselves from a reliance upon knowledge in social science as divided into systems and are thinking more definitely now in terms of individual hypotheses which will be retained so long as they seem to be verified, so long as they are useful.
This is an encouraging sign, and I think it may be in part attributable to the influence of Freud, because after all, the desire for a system in any field, I think, and not just in the field of religion or the social sciences generally, is a desire for security, to have everything nailed down neatly. And it may be that at this point we are showing some signs of increased maturity in dealing with the complex problems of human behavior.
I quite agree. I remember William James many years ago made a division of the human race into what he called the tender-minded and the tough-minded. And according to James, the tender-minded mind is the tender-minded person, is the person who seeks refuge in systems, whether they are religious systems or secular. And the tough-minded tends to be more nearly the empiricist, the man who is willing to face the fact that life is inherently complex and that we are not likely to find any single generalization that covers it all.
Well, perhaps in Freud's giving us permission to have aggressive drives, he has helped us all to become a little more tough-minded.
In that James sense, I think that may well be.
Perhaps there is a trading in of reliance on systems for a greater sharing between the various disciplines working in the social sciences. It seems to me that there is some attempt, and some fairly successful attempt being made, for people in the various social sciences to get together, exchange lingo, perhaps even settle upon some kind of common lingo, and really share and exchange ideas, which it would seem to me will lead to some revision of the basic psychologies in operation today.
Haven't we over-specialized frequently in our disciplines? I think this is true in the academic field, certainly, and this is undoubtedly related to the need for security and status also. And what you say suggests that we are beginning to recognize that we must creep out of these little caves of specialization and try to communicate with people in other areas.
I think you two have certainly put your hand on what is for me the most distinctive and probably fertile aspect of contemporary social science, at least. When I began my own work 20 years ago, 25 years ago, the compartmentalization, I should say, in the social sciences was excessive. And I think this specialization flowed, in a sense, from the heavy reliance of that time upon systems. As these once self-sealing systems have begun to be put into the background, and as we are now, as individual social scientists, attempting to work on manageable problems, we are discovering that problems don't fall neatly into an economic category, into a purely psychological category, and I think probably this working together of representatives of the different disciplines is more successful today than it has ever been before.
I think, too, that the recent experience of having so stable a science as that of physics and mathematics seem to collapse in the face of new discoveries has given the social scientists some permission to exchange ideas with other scientists.
Very true.
And to let down some of his systems.
Indeed. Think of the almost revolutionary influence of chemistry, for example, on the biological sciences in the last 10 or 20 years.
And of course, Einstein was a very upsetting influence so far as the older Newtonian physics was concerned.
Indeed. And Einstein, at the present time, presumably, I mean to say the insights or the principles of Einstein, presumably are under the impact of work now going on that we may not know anything about.
Mm-hmm. Don't you think, though, that this kind of question and doubt about the systems of knowledge that man has assumed that he has, that this creates some increased anxiety and increased concern in the individuals who have come to rely on experts? Those individuals who are aware of neuroses now, are aware of themselves as persons, are better aware of the world in which they live, improved communication, transportation, etc., has brought them face to face with the problems of the world, and they turn to the experts for specific, structured, unequivocal answers. And what do they find instead? That the experts are saying that our whole system structure has great failings, and we have serious doubts about the conclusions that we have arrived at in the past and that we are arriving at now.
This has created, I think, an educational problem, not just within the schools, but for the public generally. In other words, we're going to have to learn to live with our anxieties and not just think in terms of how can we get rid of all of our anxieties. For it's important, I think, that not only the experts, but the average person who makes no claim to being an expert recognize that we still know very little about many things that we would like to know. And if we accept this with some degree of humility or teachability, and I would equate those terms, then the methodological skepticism of the expert or the researcher need not terrify us. We can recognize that this is the way in which we become candidates for larger growth and larger insight. But of course it does involve real education.
Some of your words, Professor Ross, incline me to a question that I'd like to direct at our colleague, Dr. Rudin, and it has to do with recognition of anxieties, but it has to do also with the quest for adjustment that seems to me to be one of the byproducts of the great influence of Freud and of psychology and psychiatry in general in our own time. Is there not a danger that we may be, in society, possibly depriving ourselves of some of the creative consequences of a little insecurity, of a little maladjustment, if we tend to convert adjustment and security into idols.
We have talked before about the anxiety of man as being one of the tools by which he learns. It is only through having these anxieties, only through having these questions and concerns about his own life that he can begin to investigate his own life. We certainly develop a culture, we develop a civilization in response to anxieties. This being the case, if we are to tranquilize ourselves pharmaceutically, surgically, or ideationally, then we really do not progress. We really regress in terms of our culture and civilization. We are unable to make adequate contributions to an improved understanding of ourselves.
In other words, I think I heard a psychiatrist say in a lecture one evening that anxiety can be the cutting edge of the mind in its approach to a problem.
Exactly. We need motivation, and there is no better motivation than concern and anxiety about a subject. Certainly, we get to the point at times when the anxiety becomes paralyzing. But up to that point, it acts as a constructive energy for us.
What we're demanding, is it not, is more realism in our approach to life. Not sentimentalism, not pessimism, or a sense of overweening guiltiness or inadequacy, but realism. And I'm reminded of a statement that somebody made along the way, that in order to see reality, or the world, or experience as it is, we must be willing for reality or the world to be what it is. In other words, we have to pull ourselves out of this subjectivity or this desire for too much adjustment and simply learn to use the equipment we have. And I think that one of the contributions that Freud has made in this regard perhaps has shown up most in the area of childhood. I think a great number of people now no longer think of the child either on the one hand as a mass of perdition, as Augustine and many Orthodox Christians describe the child, nor as a bundle of sweetness and light. I think we've begun to recognize that the child is a bundle of a good many potentialities, and these can be directed in constructive ways, or they can be distorted and thus come out in all kinds of unfortunate antisocial ways.
I certainly agree with you about the lasting impact of Freud's insights so far as our understanding of childhood is concerned, and I wonder too if we are not deeply indebted to him for having been perhaps the first to present systematically, I do not say the first, but the first to present systematically the whole area of irrationality as a mode of behavior and the concept of the unconscious. Here it seems to me we are dealing with the beginnings of what I think is the most important single sphere of the interpersonal sciences, and that is the study of motivation.
Isn't it interesting that a man growing out of a period of rationalism should allow us to accept concepts of the irrational in ourselves and to develop a system about the most unsystematic, most illogical parts of ourselves, the unconscious aspects of our thinking?
Quite right. Where I think Freud failed, in a sense, is in his lack of recognition of the truly important influence of the interpersonal relationships in adult life. I think probably the revisionists of Freud and some of the sociologists have given a great deal of important addition to Freud's earlier work along this line.
It seems to me that, again, we have to recognize the history and the time factor itself. Freud, in his early work, became involved with the unconscious, the concept of the unconscious, the rat race of the unconscious, and he had to explain and define this. And he really spent a lifetime in trying to understand the unconscious processes of man, which led him into an understanding, which he was able to share quite eloquently, of the id and of the superego, but which left him with little opportunity to examine the conscious aspects of man, the ego of man, which is the part of man through which the individual has contact with the environment, so that the whole area of interpersonal contact, of interpersonal relationship, of the relationship of man to his environment was left out simply because there wasn't time to examine this.
And isn't this one of the areas where perhaps some of the greatest adventuring can be done in the decades ahead? Freud threw some light into the cellar area of man's psyche. This has led some Oriental thinkers and psychologists to say that he tended to equate man with the unconscious, and from their standpoint he ignored what they call the superconscious. But from what you were saying about the ego, I'm wondering if it isn't in this area that we need to concentrate more now that we have thrown some light on the unconscious, namely, what is it that makes man distinctively man as an integrated personality? We know that he has this cellar region. We'd like to know more about it. We know that his superego can frequently be a tyrant, and Freud was in revolt against the tyrannous superego of the Victorian age. But in this area of the ego, to use Freud's term, perhaps this is where we need to do more exploration, and maybe then we will discover what a whole personality is, and not think so much in terms of these three segmentations of the psyche.
Quite right, and I think probably one other important difference of contemporary thought in psychology and the social sciences is that it is no longer seeking world hypotheses, and by that I mean generalizations which are aimed at the totality of man, the totality of society. We're more modest now, I think, in all of these fields, and even when we're not confining ourselves to the small hypotheses and problems, at least we don't go above the middle-sized hypotheses and problems.
This is again a part of our caution. We're thrown in with the other disciplines working in related fields, and we find that their discoveries are so relevant to our own that we do need to be more cautious about our statements.
That's right. What we refer to as caution and modesty are byproducts, I think, one, of the diminishing lack of faith in great secular systems of thought, and second, and I think probably more important, the healthy recognition of the possibilities of interrelationship of the social sciences. Well, gentlemen, I think we have reached the concluding point, and to you, Dr. Floyd Ross, Professor of World Religions of the Southern California School of Theology, and you, Dr. Edward Rudin, Chief Psychiatrist of the Riverside State Mental Hygiene Clinic, our thanks for a pleasant and profitable discussion.